Hello, listeners of Illusion. I just wanted to forewarn you that this particular podcast episode contains opinions. There's some political opinions, there's some general opinions, and there's some very strong opinions on a certain author. These are the opinions of the individual people speaking at the time, and don't necessarily reflect the opinions of everyone involved with Temporal Discussion, the Nightmare podcast. Looking at our analytics on Anchor.fm, it appears that 100% of you are adults. So I'm sure you already know that it's okay to have opinions. And equally, it's okay to disagree with other people's opinions. We ask you to bear that in mind as you listen, and we sincerely hope that you enjoy the podcast, whether you agree with us or not. Welcome, listeners of Illusion, to Temporal Discussion, the episode-by-episode Nightmare Retrospective podcast. I'm Martin Harder, and I haven't thought of an introduction line yet.
And I'm Martin O'Doney, and neither have I, because my head at the moment is stuck in 1990.
The fourth incarnation of the greater game is almost upon us, but before we get that underway, we're going to finish off our two episode zeros. We're going to take a look at some of the news stories that took place during the off-season. Now, due to not wanting to make a podcast episode that's 13 hours long, we've chosen one or two news stories to concentrate on each month, due to the period being a very news-heavy time, thanks to the end of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany, and the potential start of the Gulf War as well, I should add. I think we should stress that we're not saying that these stories are any more important than anything else that was going on in the world at the time. It's just the ones that have jumped out to us.
Yes, there's plenty to look at.
And now time turns. The recording light burns, time out is gone, the podcast is on.
Or to put that more precisely, time will turn in the next episode, and the recording light will start burning then. Timeout is actually still in place, but we're just yammering away anyway. And so the podcast is sort of on kind of by accident.
I've actually commissioned a jingle for this bit, sort of radio-style jingle that goes...
Temporal Discussion. Bringing you the latest news from 1990.
We should also mention at this point that people are now paying tribute to us on YouTube.
Yeah, Amberson. They used to be Albion, but they're now called Amberson, I believe.
Play a little bit of their remix of the Corridor of the Catacombs theme.
Oh yes, it's the greatest Corridor of Catacombs, but it disappoints time after time. They are tossing up, but they just can't make it stop. Ah yes, that was a way to run.
Nightmare concluded Series 3 in December 1989, so our first couple of news stories are from January 1990.
Yes.
We're going to start off with a nice, jolly news story to start the year.
The feel-good story of the entire show, I think this one is.
Because on the 19th and 20th of January 1990, the January Massacre took place.
And we use the word massacre very literally.
It was a violent crackdown on the civilians of Baku by Soviet forces. It was part of the state of emergency brought about by the ongoing dissolution of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev was the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party at the time, and Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov decided that military law was necessary due to an attempt by the Azerbaijani independence movement to overthrow the Soviet Azerbaijani government.
It says something about Russia in general. After all these years, it's still only an estimate. 147 civilians were killed, 800 were seriously injured, and 5 are still officially missing. The Supreme Soviet of Azerbaijan, in a really impressive display of understatement, declared it an act of aggression by the Soviet army. Even under Gorbachev, there was an awful lot wrong with the Soviet Union morally as well as practically. And right up to the very end of the Soviet Union, these sorts of things were still going on. We talk about how terrible Putin is today, and we're not wrong to say that. There are times when he has been absolutely appalling. But it does seem to be actually something about Russia itself. It's too big, too diverse. It's got over 100 different languages is just inside Russian boundaries, to say nothing of all the former Soviet republics. Russia is heavily dependent on oil and gas that comes from the center of the country, and so therefore it can't afford to let go of the center of the country, even though it has almost nothing in common with Moscow at all. And so it also needs to hold on to the southern republics to provide a military barrier against attacks on the center by neighboring countries to steal the oil and the gas. So you've got this constant problem of different cultures that don't really mesh very well, having to stay together in the same country. And so the result of that is Russia keeps on defaulting to a rather brutal dictatorship. The difficulty is the only way it's going to become democratic is if it's broken up. If it's broken up, Moscow will have almost nothing in terms of natural resources that it can use.
Yeah, there's no chance they're going to let that happen anytime soon.
Absolutely not. But anyway, that's quite a powerful start, isn't it?
Yes, and on a much lighter and shallower note, the 15th of January saw the birth of American actor Christopher Warren Jr. Warren Jr., as we all know, played the popular role of Zeke Baylor in Disney's High School Musical franchise.
What, when he was born? He was talented.
Yes, impressive, isn't it?
Yeah, he's amazing. He did that in January 1990. Wow. Another event in January that I think is worth mentioning is the US. You know, whilst we're getting all pompous about how terrible Russia is, it should be pointed out the USA in international politics is every bit as bad. And in that very same month, it invaded Panama and deposed by force Manuel Noriega. Whatever you might think about him, that is once again the Americans basically imposing governments on everybody else, which is something America is often very, very pompous about Russia doing.
Do you want to read February the 2nd?
It's happier news in the dying apartheid state of South Africa at this point. On the 2nd of February, the president, F.W. de Klerk, announced that the African National Congress was finally, at last, to finally be legalized. And he also put into motion plans to release Nelson Mandela from prison. And those plans moved very quickly, I have to say, which is a sign of how easy it actually would have been.
I was going to say, as we're talking about Nelson Mandela in prison, maybe we should talk a little bit about the Mandela effect.
You can.
Because we've experienced this within Nightmare itself.
Yeah, group memory is the same, but always wrong.
So it actually comes from when Nelson Mandela did pass away. A lot of people were very confused because they remembered him dying in prison, which obviously didn't happen. But there were enough people who remembered it for it to be a thing.
Everybody remembered it exactly the same way, and yet it's not true. Mandela lived for years and years after. It was a very quick-moving process, the freeing of Nelson Mandela. De Klerk announced on the 2nd that there were now plans to release Mandela. By the 10th of February, de Klerk made a formal announcement that Mandela was about to be released. And the very next day, de Klerk actually kept his word.
This was the moment the world paused to applaud. The day the myth yielded to the man and Nelson Mandela walked to freedom. His steps were firm, his gait measured and deliberate, betraying only the hesitation that comes of a man thrust into the spotlight again after 27 years. The crowd outside the gate of Mr. Mandela's last prison was small. The authorities had discouraged any mass gathering here with injunctions and roadblocks. These were the few who were undeterred. Mandelas were soon engulfed. A few steps more, a gesture of solidarity and a friendly wave, and Nelson Mandela was about to set out again on the next installment of his political odyssey. A small convoy was to accompany Nelson Mandela into town. Behind him, the prison gates. Ahead of him, a multiplicity of questions and anxieties about the future of this country. Mr. Mandela will clearly need the support of these people in the weeks to come. In his long absence, the political landscape of this country has changed. Expectations are high, and most of them center on him, a man who has spent more than a third of his life in prison, and who is driven into Cape Town today in style. At a rally in the city centre here tonight, Mr. Mandela told his supporters that the armed struggle has to continue. But he did say, too, that he was willing to test the climate for negotiations.
Mandela had actually been in the prison for 27 years by that point, almost as long as he lived after leaving prison. He was already an extremely elderly and rather frail man by the time he was released. It was a very common refrain, especially in the late 80s, from Britain to South Africa, was "Free Nelson Mandela, free Nelson Mandela." I don't know if the British public had any effect on that particular discussion.
7th February, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union voted to release its monopoly of power. This in turn led to the introduction of multi-party elections in the former Soviet Union.
It was the right thing to do, I must stress, morally and ethically, it was the right thing to do. But I don't think Gorbachev was in any way ready for the implications of it. And he certainly didn't get the Communist Party ready for what it would involve, because all of a sudden, all sorts of not just liberal interests, but actually quite right-wing interests started forming their own parties. And the Communist Party wasn't really ready to campaign against them. One of the reasons why the oligarchy problem at the mid to late 90s became so dominant was because of these free market interests forming their own parties and essentially destabilizing the Soviet Union to such a point that within a couple of years it was gone and sort of replaced by this big mafia hellhole that it turned into. So it was the right thing to do, but it does show that Gorbachev didn't really have a proper plan when he started his reforms. He still wanted to maintain communism. He wanted communism to face some facts about how inefficient it had become because it wouldn't tolerate dissent. Political reform was desperately needed to get rid of the corruption as well that had become rife in the Communist Party. If you're not allowed to dissent, then you're not allowed to blow the whistle when you see examples of corrupt behavior by officials in the government. That was one of the things that desperately needed to change as well. But he didn't realize what it would lead to if he didn't have a firm plan in place for his own party to deal with the changing landscape. And ultimately, although you can say many good things for Gorbachev, he wasn't a strategist, shall we say, and he ended up basically destroying his own party to a large degree. I've got another event, which is on the 13th of February. That was the day that the treaty was signed, agreeing the reunification of Germany. Officially at the World Cup later that year, although everyone says West Germany won the World Cup, officially it was actually Germany.
On to March, and this is an interesting one.
Very, very eventful month on a number of levels.
Yes. On the 1st of March, the board game production company Steve Jackson Games was raided by the United States Secret Service. This is due to an incident in 1988 where telecommunications company Bell South were made aware that a proprietary document relating to their 911 system had been posted to a bulletin board system in Illinois.
I'm sure every single one of our audience say, "Oh yes, I remember the 911 system on the bulletin board system in Illinois very well."
There is a link to Nightmare.
There is, yeah.
So it was reported to the Secret Service in 1989, who found that the document had been posted on the Phoenix BBS in Austin, Texas, which was operated by Lord Blankenship, who at the time was employed by SJG and moderated the company's own BBS, Illuminati. The Secret Service saw this as a probable cause to search computers belonging to Blankenship and the company, and they issued a search warrant on February 28th. When it was executed on March the 1st, 3 company computers were seized along with over 300 floppy disks, including, remember floppy disks?
For some of our younger audience, a floppy disk is what we used before they invented memory sticks.
It's the save icon.
It's the save icon, given plastic form. They don't contain quite as much data as a memory stick, though.
So this 300 floppy disks.
I feel so old!
So these included such software as the master copy of GURPS Cyberpunk, an RPG which the company was about to release. The seized material was returned in June, and SJG then sued the Secret Service for damages from loss of revenue. Steve Jackson and 3 other employees also sued for invasion of privacy. SJG won 2 out of the 3 suits when the case went to trial in 1993. Incidentally, and here's the link, one of Steve Jackson Group's more popular games is Nightmare Chess, spelt with a K. A card game where the cards change the default rules of chess. So despite the spelling of the name, it has nothing else to do with Nightmare the TV show, so it's only a very tenuous link.
Nothing at all. In fact, if you tried to imply that there was an actual link, you'd probably get sued yourself. But it is interesting to know there was a Nightmare thing. That carried on for a few years there, but eventually it did sort of get settled in court. There was actually quite a few events happening in March, though, outside of the world of gaming. It was actually the start of the poll tax riots. One riot in Brixton was so violent that the area had to be locked down by the police. On the 11th of March, the collapse of the Soviet Union really began with the declaration of independence by Lithuania. 2 days later, the USSR approved a new constitution. And 2 days after that, Mikhail Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Communist Party, became the first, and as it turns out, the only president of the Soviet Union. Just 5 days after that, Imelda Marcos, the wife of Ferdinand de Marcos, the dictator of the Philippines for some years, was put on trial for corruption. On the 30th of March, the collapse of the Soviet Union continued when Estonia declared its independence from Moscow. And then on the 31st of March, we're back to the poll tax riots as the Second Battle of Trafalgar was fought in Trafalgar Square. A few people were a little bit annoyed with Thatcher at that point, I think.
It was a year for riots, wasn't it?
Yes, and a year for uprisings. The Lithuanian uprising was actually called the Singing Revolution. I've never actually understood why.
According to Google, it was called the Singing Revolution because of the role singing played in the protests of the mid-1980s. But singing had always been a major unifying force for Estonians while they endured 50 years of the Soviet rule.
There was a massive tornado across the central belt of the United States that lasted between 2 to 3 days from the 11th of March to the 13th. Soviet soldiers who'd been occupying Hungary for many a long year also started being withdrawn as of the 12th of March, which is another sign of the impending collapse of the USSR. The USSR had basically been more or less becoming unsustainable ever since the disaster at Chernobyl power station. The resources the country had to use up to contain the nuclear fallout was so enormous that it basically bankrupted the Soviet economy.
April the 1st saw the eruption of the UK's worst ever prison riot at Strangeways Prison in Manchester.
This evening, Strangeways was ablaze. Prisoners who'd taken over the jail were now doing their best to destroy it completely. What had started during morning prayers in the prison chapel as a disturbance involving 50 prisoners rapidly became a riot involving nearly 1,000. They overcame prison officers, stole keys and opened as many cells as they could. Some smashed their way onto the roof and hurled missiles at the police gathering below. A prison store was raided, and while some prisoners dressed up in officers' uniforms, others took off their clothes to taunt the police.
It's quite obvious that it's a major incident that has required us to bring many police officers to the scene, and it's my job to try and contain that with other people.
As prison staff evacuated Strangeways, hundreds of police, many in full riot gear, surrounded the prison. The tactic was containment, and prisoners in areas of the jail not affected by the rioting were bussed to other prisons. During the afternoon, grisly tales began to emerge of what was happening to sexual offenders in Strangeways, now at the mercy of other inmates. A steady stream of prisoners came out on stretchers. They'd been severely beaten, but then rumours of prisoners being killed and mutilated. The police wouldn't confirm there had been murders. A fireman, though, said he'd seen about a dozen bodies. What had started as a riot over bad conditions was now a bloody and brutal conflict of prisoner versus prisoner.
To oversimplify it, it was part of a protest against the treatment of prisoners by the guards, as well as the conditions that they were kept in. It started in the prison chapel before spreading, and it lasted for over 3 weeks and remains the longest prison riot in Britain's history. The riot left 2 dead and hundreds injured.
It did turn extremely violent. They did have a point, I think. The way prisons were being maintained in the 80s and early 90s was unacceptable and really quite inhuman. I do understand the arguments that you don't want prison to be too pleasant because otherwise it ceases to be a deterrent, but there needs to be more focus on the rehabilitation side of prison. Trying to turn them into actual medieval dungeons is not a good idea. I think we should leave those for game shows. There was another noticeable event in April on the 24th.
For main engine start, T-minus 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery with the Hubble Space Telescope, our window on the universe.
Mission Control, Houston.
Roll program. Roger, roll, Discovery.
Can't believe it's been that long, actually. In my head, I've always thought of the Hubble telescope being launched around about 1994. Rather amusingly, after they'd launched it into orbit, they were to discover there were some problems with it. It's an international project. A number of major countries were involved in constructing the Hubble telescope, and one bit of it, made by the British, turned out to have been made to the wrong specifications. namely the lens for viewing far off distances in other galaxies. And it was the British who f***ed it up a bit for everybody else. Nothing ever changes in this world. It's always our fault.
Technically, it's their fault for using metric, innit?
Yes, of course. The rest of the world, we're getting it right. The rest of the world is getting it wrong again. Absolutely.
I've gone back to metric without telling us.
Even if national pride actually made sense, you should never be proud of being British, because what do we ever do right? There's no point in being a gammon, because there's no point in being British. We're rubbish. That's it. We're rubbish. Well, nightmare is something we got right, to be fair. We can be very good at being innovative.
May the 2nd, in London, a mugger armed with a knife robbed a courier of £292 million worth of bearer bonds.
That was a mugging, everybody. That was a bank fraud. That's a mugging.
It remains the second largest mugging ever.
That is such a City of London moment in history, isn't it? Oh, I've got £292 million of bonds in my back pocket.
I'm not sure it was a back pocket thing. I think it was likely courier van.
You know what I mean. You know what I mean. On the 15th, the pro-Soviet inter-movement attempted to take power in Estonia, but they were brought down by the locals, so the revolution could continue.
And on the 18th, East and West Germany signed a treaty to merge their economic and social systems effective July the 1st.
That's why officially it was Germany playing at the World Cup, not West Germany, even though everybody put West Germany. There was also a treaty signed between the USA and the USSR on the 19th of May to end the production of chemical weapons, except ones that they wanted to carry on selling to Iraq at this point. They changed their minds on that a little bit later in the year.
If we broadcast this next bit, are we going to get sued?
Well, probably, given the individual's general behaviour on Twitter these days.
Right, so let's do this really carefully. Sometime in June, a lady by the name of allegedly didn't read one of the worst witch books, and then somehow she came up with the idea of a school where young witches and wizards were taught magic all by herself. She began writing and the novel was the first of the series, a franchise that earned her massive respect from her fans, something she has been doing her very best to destroy ever since. We're going to leave it at that. Except to say that is a disgusting transphobic piece of...
Yes, so I'm glad you said that. Yes, she is. There's an awful lot of things that's horrible about her.
It is possible to appreciate the art and not the artist.
Yeah, that is true. But she is horrible. You read some of the stuff she puts up on her Twitter feed. All seriously, she's a horrible person, really. Not just her views on transphobia. She encourages... should I say this? She encourages the lie about there being an anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party. There hasn't been one. Just want to put this out here. 56 people, okay? That's the number of people who were found guilty to be anti-Semitic in the Labour Party during the time Jeremy Corbyn was in charge. I just want to put that out there. It's a lie. There were 600,000 members, just 56 of them were actually found guilty in the end. It's a lie. They lied to you, all of you. There was no anti-Semitism crisis. It was purely a lie to discredit Jeremy Corbyn. And she joined in with it. Absolutely, really pushed it really hard. She's scum. So what happened in June 1990, Mr. H?
On the 1st of June, the US President George H.W. Bush and Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev signed a treaty to end chemical weapon production and to begin destruction of their respective stock. On the same day, British Army member Major Michael Dillon Lee and Private William Robert Davies were shot and killed by the Provisional IRA.
Yes. I'm not in any way going after Major Dillon Lee or Private Davis, okay? But I do want to make this point, which is the British media's way of reporting this event was so hypocritical. I'm not saying it's all right that those two members of the army were shot, but the way that this was reported at the time was acting like Dillon Lee and Davies were both two young kids sitting at home watching TV, and then somebody across the road launched a howitzer blast at their home or something. No, it's terrible what happened to them, but at the same time, they were soldiers. It needed to be reported in that light. They were innocent members of the army, you could say.
Were they specifically targeted, or were they just targeted because they were members of the army?
As far as I understand it, they were targeted because they were members of the army. Dillon Lee was was living in Dortmund when he was killed. So he's spending his entire time just a few miles from Soviet troops who could have spent every day shooting at him, depending on how the Cold War went. I'm not defending the fact they died. I agree it's terrible that they died, but the way it was reported made it sound like they were just civilians just going around their day-to-day business. By pushing this this as an act of murder, it makes it very difficult to progress the
diplomatic.
Yeah, it makes it difficult to progress any kind of peace process with the Irish if you're going to do that.
So just to reiterate, what you're saying is that the actual act of the killing was abhorrent.
It was, yeah.
But so was the way it was reported.
Yes. War is abhorrent. Abhorrent things happen to soldiers in war. That's one of the reasons why I want us to avoid having wars. It's one of the reasons why I want us to stop invading other countries and stop bringing down opposing governments just because they disagree with us. That's what makes war something to avoid, is the fact that it's abhorrent. But trying to pretend that this was some kind of act of wild and unreasoned aggression is not true. And it's unhelpful reporting it that way.
I don't really have anything to add on it because this is very much your area of expertise. I don't know enough about it to comment.
You know me, my view of the British broadcast media is that it's no better than the Russian broadcast media or the Iranian broadcast media. What I do find, quite honestly, is if you want the truth about what's happening in a country, just don't consult the media of that country. Consult the media of any of its enemies, and you'll probably get an accurate report, because you don't need to make things up as a rule. When you wanted to disgrace a country, you can normally just tell the truth about it. So you can get an accurate report of what's going on in another country just by consulting a rival's media. I abhor the methods of the IRA, but the way the troubles were reported in the British media was always ridiculously skewed. It was only when acknowledging the Irish had a point in the 1990s that the peace process actually started working.
So, moving on to July.
July! Can you do Nessun Dorma? This was the world in July 1990. It was that Pavarotti bloke doing the titles on BBC's World Cup coverage. Ra, 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 ra. I don't know a single lyric of this because it's all in Italian. And even though my surname is Italian too, I don't speak a word of it. Oh God! If there's one thing that makes me nostalgic for 1990, it was having Nessun Dorma every evening on football. Even though the World Cup itself was actually rubbish that year, it was made memorable because it was in Italy and because you had Pavarotti doing Nessun Dorma on the titles for the BBC.
I've actually seen the Three Tenors live.
Yeah, actually live.
One of my first concerts,
yeah. Very good. They did a massive concert that year. I can't remember which month it was in. It was sometime after the World Cup had finished, but they did a massive concert together that year. I remember it was broadcast live. I certainly wasn't there.
My dad worked for Olivetti.
Oh, right.
And they would quite often get tickets to see the Three Tenors.
Now that's a perk.
And
that is what I call a perk, yeah.
They even hosted them once, which is when I saw them. I say I saw them live. I was present in the building. I spent most of my time in the media room of the hotel watching Winnie the Pooh. I wandered in for like one song.
I thought for a moment you were going to say my very good friend Luciano Pavarotti.
Luciano Pavarotti.
Yeah, a very good friend of mine. Well, I was once in the same building as him.
There's a very bad joke in a very poor spoof movie called The Silence of the Hams, which no one's ever heard of. And so every time I hear the word Pavarotti, because of that movie, I just think...
Yes, it was Pavarotti who had eaten a cow and farted himself to pieces.
You've rather lowered the atmosphere there. Most of the World Cup was in June, technically speaking. The famous semi-final when Germany beat England, and the moment we all associate with Paul Gascoigne bursting into tears. That was actually the last day of June, I think it was. But it became such an iconic moment.
On July the 8th, West Germany... Germany defeated Argentina 1-0 in the 1990 FIFA World Cup final.
And there it is. West Germany win the World Cup for the third time and equal the record of Italy and Brazil. They take the championship away from Argentina, and Franz Beckenbauer becomes the second man to play in and manage a World Cup winning team. The German supporters celebrate, and after what has to go down as a disappointing final, then the result has to be seen to be right by the watching world. West Germany made all the running, and there's trouble again on the pitch. The referee was surrounded and pushed and shoved by Argentine players, and the inquiry into this match, I believe, will go on for quite some time. FIFA will have to do something about it, because South American players have manhandled the officials. And Carlos Bilardo's career, well, somebody's been punched in the face, it would seem. Carlos Bilardo's career has ended in disgrace, really, for his team, while Beckenbauer's has ended in ecstasy. The scenes on the pitch are quite extraordinary. There's celebration on one side, and there's anger and resentment and hostility on the other. One or two of the Argentines are now coming over to shake hands, and the mood seems to be calming down. But quite what that's done for the game of football, I'm not entirely sure, and it would be too early to judge. The game itself was all West Germany's from the first whistle. They made opportunity, and Maradona had none. The chances were all at one end, and the lack of ambition on the part of the ex-world champions was quite startling. They finished the match with 9 men and very few friends. But for the West Germans, who from the start of this tournament, and I saw their first match against Yugoslavia, have by and large tried to attack, tried to show the better side of the game. They have been involved in 1 or 2 unsavoury incidents, but their supporters will feel that they've proved again, having played in 5 of the last 7 World Cup finals, and now won it 3 times, Trevor Brooking, that on the night certainly the right team won.
It should be called Germany, really, because the unification process had started. I actually remember watching the World Cup final, actually thinking, this is incredibly boring, this game. There's so much diving and so many fouls. They might as well have got rid of the football and just had a diving and kicking competition. Germany eventually did win it with a very, very dodgy penalty about 6 minutes from time. So on to the 25th of July, and away from football, but still kind of related to sport, if you count baseball as a sport. What must surely go down as the worst ever rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner by a person who in recent years has become absolutely universally loathed all around the world after years of being one of the most loved comedians in North America.
Roseanne Barr said the gesture and the spit were meant as a parody of baseball players, that her singing was from the heart. The Padres apologized Friday for the rendition, and National League President Bill White essentially said that apology was needed. The team's new managing partner created the Roseanne show.
Obviously, it didn't work exactly as anyone had planned.
That was obvious from some of the public reaction in the city. Husband Tom Arnold defended his wife.
Ma'am, is it just men that get to grab their crotch and spit? Have you ever grabbed your crotch and spit, ma'am?
Not in a public place, no.
She sang the national anthem as best she could.
Are the red country one?
And she did a great job.
And the rockets red.
You know, I was real proud of her.
Or the land of the free.
She knew all the words.
I think this was my one shot.
And about 250 Americans agree.
We're talking, of course, about Roseanne Barr, who at the time, her sitcom was still one of the most watched TV programs in America. But as we know, in recent years, Roseanne Barr has shown herself to be an unbelievably unpleasant person with some of the nastiest, most racist and intolerant right-wing views anywhere on earth.
It's like she saw and just went, hold my beer.
And even her fellow cast members on Roseanne now want absolutely nothing to do with her. So that's a kind of spoiled July for everybody. On a much darker note, at the end of July, on July the 30th, the last British politician to be assassinated until Joe Cox a few years ago, Ian Gow, was assassinated by an IRA car bomb outside his house in England. Dark ends to July and a very dark start to August. On the 2nd, that was the day Iraq invaded Kuwait.
Yes, an act that eventually led to the Gulf War.
You're dealing with one of the real madmen of the 20th century.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw, reporting tonight from NBC News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the tiny country that is a primary source of oil for much of the Western world. But tonight, the United States, the Soviet Union, Israel, and other powers are concentrating on diplomatic and economic solutions to this surprising and dangerous development. The invasion by 100,000 Iraqi troops backed by air cover and tanks was brutally efficient. Iraq wants control of Kuwait's territory, its oil, and the money that comes with it. Iraq insists that it was invited in by a rebel Kuwaiti government, but no one believes that.
Without wanting to defend Saddam Hussein, who was always a bit of a bastard, there was actually a genuine provocation by Kuwait. The reason why Saddam decided to invade, the main reason actually, was Kuwait were guilty of what's called slant drilling. Slant drilling is when, rather than digging straight down for oil, you point your drill bit in a diagonal direction so that underground it crosses the border. You start drilling right next to the border and you cross the border underground, and so you end up tapping oil that actually belongs to another country. Kuwait had actually been doing this to steal oil from Iraq for years. They'd been able to get away with it for the previous 8 years because Iraq had of course been tangled up in the Iran-Iraq war, which meant that they didn't really have any military resources to spare to sort of lay down the law to Kuwait. That war had finally ended about a year earlier. The Iraqi military had now recovered its strength, thanks to the British and Americans supplying them with rather a lot of arms. It had now recovered, and Kuwait, rather stupidly, had carried on slant drilling. And so that's actually the real underlying reason why Saddam invaded. It doesn't get much mention in the Western media, strangely. I'm not sure that actually justifies going as far as an invasion. I think they could easily put a stop to it other ways, but you cannot say Kuwait were innocent. That's my position on it. I don't think the Iraq actually should have invaded, but I do have some sympathy with why they did it. Saddam, yes, he probably did want to become the dominant power in the Middle East. And yes, it probably was for the best that he was stopped. But the thing that we never acknowledged, well, or at least we never openly acknowledged to ourselves in this country, is that our allies in the Middle East are every bit as bad as the enemies we got there. It's good to stop Ba'athist Iraq from trying to form a new sort of sultanate across the Middle East. But the ally who was helping us to do it is Saudi Arabia, which is just about the most oppressive regime on the face of the earth. And Iraq, up until the moment he invaded Kuwait, was in fact our dear ally in the struggle against Iran. So these things are not nearly as black and white as our media like to paint them.
On the 12th of August, fighting broke out between the Zulu people and the Xhosa people in South Africa. By the end of August, more than 500 people were killed as a result.
Yes, indeed. Not everything was good in South Africa as apartheid began to wind down. The fact that over 500 people were killed makes it really quite shocking that it's not a more famous sort of unofficial civil war than it should. Anyway, on a brighter bit of news, something to do with dinosaurs, Mr. H.
Yes, on the same day, the best preserved Tyrannosaurus rex specimen ever found was discovered in South Dakota. The specimen is named Sue after its finder, Sue Hendrickson.
Yes, I'm not sure that's quite as big a compliment to Ms. Hendrickson as it was intended to be, if you think about it. I'd have thought they thought it was the best preserved Tyrannosaurus rex specimen ever found, and then realised it was just Norman Tebbit on holiday. But
or it's Roseanne Barr.
Yes, it could have been Roseanne Barr, or maybe August 28th was the Plainfield tornado. This is actually possibly an early warning sign about climate change because there were so many tornadoes in 1990. The Plainfield tornado was force 5 on the Fujita scale, which basically means off the scale.
The finger of God.
There were 3 towns in Illinois that really came close to being flattened outright. Plainfield, Crest Hill, and I think it's pronounced Joliet. It may be Joliet. 29 people were killed. It was the strongest tornado at that point ever recorded in the Chicago area. So once again, we had a warning 30 years ago and we didn't pay attention. So that was a rather bleak ending to August. Just before Nightmare resumed at the beginning of September, Pope John Paul II went on a tour of Africa and visited Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, and the Ivory Coast in the space of about 10 days. And this was actually sort of the breakup of the Soviet Union. This bit on the 2nd of September, Transnistria is a little region in Moldavia. Today we call it Moldova, but back then it was still called Moldavia. Transnistria was a small part of that, and it not only declared independence from Moscow, it also declared independence from Moldavia, and that's led to more trouble that happened. But that happened after Nightmare. Nightmare resumed. So it was a very confused time. Living through it didn't seem that big a deal at the time. But 1990 was pretty earth-shaking stuff, wasn't it? Some pretty huge events all around the world. It pretty much certainly redrew the map of Europe. But that brings us up to date.
We'll be back soon with Series 4, Episode 1. I'm actually quite looking forward to this series. I know we've kind of dunked on Series 4 quite a lot, but there are some genuine, really good bits in it.
There are good bits. The problem is, it always seemed like, well, that bit worked last time, so we'll include it in this quest. So you keep on getting the same quest over and over. But we'll cross that bridge as we come to it. So, are you feeling nostalgic now that we've gone through this quick trek through 1990?
Ever so nostalgic. In fact, I'm going to go play some Commander Keen once we finish this, I think.
Oh, I loved Commander Keen. I've got every single one of them. The ID Anthology was released in 1997. It's the ID games basically put almost everything they'd ever published into one.
The ID Anthology.
ID Anthology, yes, you're quite right. But it had all of the Commander Keen games, including Commander Keen Dreams, which was the prototype for the game engine they used for parts 4 to 6. And I would play it obsessively during the early 1990s.
Before we started doing the podcast, I was writing a video series called Assure and Endure, and it was done in the style of the old Protect and Survive videos. And through the whole thing, you learnt small things. There was a national emergency. You were being told to stay in your houses. And slowly, over a number of episodes, it was revealed that there was actually an alien invasion going on. But everyone would have known it in the first episode if they could read the Galactic Standard Alphabet.
Very Commander Keen. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, unfortunately, Assure and Endure didn't get much further because then the COVID thing happened and suddenly it didn't seem so funny anymore.
No, suddenly there was a crisis that meant everyone had to stay at home.
There is a bit in the first Commander Keen game where John Romero spelt out the word in platforms. Right, so that's the end of episode 0, part 2. Okay, so we had a bit of an audio glitch at this point, which wasn't noticeable until I came to edit the episode, but it's literally just a sign off to do now, so I'm just going to record it myself. You can follow us on Twitter, we're at NightmarePod. If you want to support the podcast, we're NightmarePod on Patreon. Speaking of Patreon, here's a shout out to keepers of the Book of Quests, David M. Rabbit, Paul McIntosh, Peter Pulsford and Scott Evans, advisors Benjamin Bloom, David Thompson and Peter Sidon, and Dungeoneer Peter Corridge. Support us on Patreon at Dungeoneer level or above to get your name mentioned in the podcast. Higher level perks also receive merchandise, have access to exclusive episodes, and if you pledge as a keeper of the Book of Quests, we'll even offer you the chance to be a guest on the podcast. Our website is nightmarepod.co.uk. If you're looking for temporal discussion merchandise, including t-shirts, stickers and other products, it's at nightmarepod.redbubble.com. You can email us at podcast@nightmarepod.co.uk and just keep telling yourself, it was only 1990, but I liked it.